Okay, it's 3 o'clock right now, so thank you everyone who's with us for being on time. I really appreciate that, but we are going to wait just a couple more minutes before we launch to let the non-timely people join us. So 2 more minutes before I start talking at you. Yes, Matt Bowser, you are automatically on mute. But thank you for joining us.
Good.
Good.
Look at this amazing vintage MWA shirt.
Whoa.
Isn't it great?
Whoa!
Bring them back.
I know, this color.
Yeah. Screams wilderness.
Oh yeah. Okay, I think I'm going to start my intro spiel and people can keep coming in as I talk. Everybody, welcome. Welcome to this lovely Tuesday afternoon webinar on the history of mining in the North Fork, or 40 years of almost mining in the North Fork, as I think we've entitled it. My name is Allie Maloney. I'm the Northwest Montana Field Director for Montana Wilderness Association. And thanks for taking an hour of your bright and sunny day to join us. And I encourage you to spend some time later this afternoon outside. This webinar is co-hosted between Montana Wilderness Association and the North Fork Preservation Association. And so with me here, we have Flannery Coates and Jed, I'm gonna say it wrong, Sankar Gordon. I'm okay. But before I introduce them, I want to briefly go over why you're muted and how to interact with us during this webinar. So you may have been experiencing lots of Zoom meetings, but this is a Zoom webinar. So the default is that as a participant, your video is off and you're muted, but we still want to interact with you and hear from you. So please use the chat bar for chat and applause and telling how great Jed looks. And then use the Q&A section for actually asking content-focused questions, and we'll try to get through those. And we'll leave a chunk of time at the end to wrap up and do more questions. Good. One more thing, checking my notes. We are recording this, although we'll cut off all of the chatter before 3 o'clock p.m. And so you'll be able to share this with friends and family who are unable to make it this afternoon. So I'm going to introduce my co-hosts and our guest star, and they'll give you a little bit more information about themselves, and then we'll focus on the North Fork. So with me here is Flannery. She's the Vice President of the North Fork Preservation Association, and she's going to tell you about her and her organization.
Hey everybody, hi, as Allie said, my name is Flannery Coates, and I am joining this webinar from our little cabin in downtown Polbridge, Montana. On behalf of the NFPA, I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to join us here today. Debo Powers, our president, wishes she could join us as well, but she sends her best from the top of Cyclone Lookout, where she will be watching over the North Fork for the next 10 days. The mission of the North Fork Preservation Association is to champion stewardship of the natural resources and protection of the exceptional biodiversity of the North Fork of the Flathead watershed in Northwest Montana. As some of you may know, our organization was founded in part due to the threat of a proposed coal mine upstream near the headwaters of the North Fork, just a few miles into British Columbia. We're about to hear more. That threat alone would have forever altered the natural ecosystem of this valley and its remote and rural character. Fortunately, though, NFPA's founder, John Frederick, implemented what some might call a unique strategies when representing conservation interests, specifically in the 80s. He bought shares of the Cabin Creek coal mine stock, giving him a seat at the table of the stakeholders in Toronto, and he voted against the proposed coal mine numerous times. With the help of fellow board member Roger Sullivan, they filed and won lawsuits against Montana Board of Oil and Gas and Cenex, whose permits to drill on state, national forest, and private land just a few miles south of Pole Ridge were revoked. He prevented the North Fork Road from being paved, a contentious issue to this day. But needless to say, the hard work of the past has paid off in the form of a world-class river and an ecosystem that remains intact for future generations to enjoy. NFPA promises to continue to share and ensure that the history definitely repeats itself. Thanks to Jed for taking the time to share with us a bit of your big thesis.
Thanks, Flannery. Jed is going to be the one talking for the majority of this presentation, and he is living here in Whitefish, and his master's thesis was on this issue. He's a board member for the Flathead Kootenai chapter of Montana Wilderness Association, and so he volunteered his expertise and his time to do this. He's currently zooming in from the Montana Conservation Corps office down in Kalispell. And Jed, you can finish your introduction, I think.
Sounds pretty good. All right, let me share my screen. Lovely. So yes, I am here today to talk a little bit about really this 40-year period of time from 1974 to 2014, which follows the original kind of efforts by a mining, like multinational mining company to mine coal on the British Columbia side of the Flathead Basin up to 2014 when the US federal government, in partnership, kind of in tandem with the British Columbia government, passed legislation to forever remove mining rights from the basin. So I'm looking at that 40-year window, and this was, I also did write a thesis on this at the University of Montana, graduating in 2018. And I love the North Fork. I've done work in the North Fork for years through Montana Conservation Corps, and yet I didn't know this story. And so I was immediately intrigued as to, how did the mining actually get prevented? If they knew for so long that it was there, and there were consistently efforts to go forward with it that got quite close to being implemented, how did they actually prevent it? And so that's kind of the origin of my interest. I am here in the MGC office. I'm in Kalispell. I'm the program manager in the Kalispell office. We're hiring crew members right now, so if anyone's interested, we still got some spots. Little shout out for MCC. But let's dive in to the presentation. Let's see. Cool. So I'm going to introduce, obviously, the North Fork. This is a place that a lot of us know, but kind of from a bigger picture, beyond Montana, beyond BC, what is this place? And then a brief description of the presentation itself today. And then what I'm really going to dive into today is kind of a timeline of events over this 40 years. Obviously, we've got 45 minutes here, so I'm not going to get too deep into anything, but I hope to hit kind of some of the high points and just tell like an interesting story, try to build this timeline for each of you. So maybe you learned something today, maybe some of you have lived up in North Fork for decades and have this mastery of knowledge, and you're just here to kind of see what the next generation of advocates is saying. Whatever it is, I hope that there's some good stuff in it for you here. I'm going to briefly touch on some lessons learned so we can kind of make something of this. This is for MWA here, and the idea, of course, is advocacy and what can we do in the future. And so what, through my research on this topic, did I learn are some valuable lessons going forward? And then at the end, we have some time for questions. Cool, let's get into it. So here we are, the International Flathead River System. And just to start off, I'm calling it the International Flathead. And that is because to British Columbians, the North Fork is just the Flathead River. Obviously to Montanans or people in the US, it's the North Fork of the Flathead River. What is so interesting about this leg of the Flathead is that it crosses an international boundary. And so one of my, kind of jumping to the end here, one of my findings is that the Canadian perspective is not always well enough represented in our kind of US Montana understanding of these issues. And so somewhat in deference to that, I decided to refer to it as the International Flathead. And I'm going to slip up and call it the North Fork because I love it. But that's kind of where that comes from. And so the entire Flathead River system, just to zoom in on this map here, it flows into the Columbia River eventually and then out into the Pacific. So this is a pretty interesting river system to start in one country, to enter into one of the US's most important basins, being the Columbia, and then to get all the way out to the Pacific. Pretty compelling, pretty interesting, crosses a lot of boundaries there. Yeah. So now just for that kind of setting the big picture, I won't spend too much time up here, but I think it's really important to talk about the fact that globally freshwater supplies are deeply, deeply threatened. Obviously, all humans rely on fresh water every single day, but the total amount of water on the earth, a very small percentage of it is fresh water, and almost all of that fresh water is threatened. And so now here we are in this topic, the North Fork, the International Flathead. We're talking about a transboundary body of water, which is a body of water that crosses an international boundary. So 40% of the world's population actually relies on fresh water that comes from a transboundary body of water. And then 90% of the world's population lives in a country where there is a transboundary body of water. And so you might think like, oh, transboundary body of water, that's kind of specific or unique. It really isn't. And they're very complicated because there are different political structures governing different environmental ethics and so forth, different economies, but they're also deeply important. And so the North Fork is this compelling story that we all know and love to a certain extent, but it is also an internationally relevant topic in terms of transboundary freshwater management. And so we have this little fake Parthenon or whatever at the bottom here, but that's just to signify governance. This idea that how do we ensure we're protecting these wonderful transboundary waters? It's through environmental governance. And so that's kind of the topic that I'm gonna sit on today. Okay, so excuse me if most of you or some of you are quite familiar with this topic, but here in front of us is the basin of the North Fork, basically, the Flathead River to British Columbians. Now, the circle you have running north of the Canadian border, the oval kind of going northwest, that is the proximate location of the coal in question, basically. And people have known basically since settlers kind of started coming into Northwest Montana and into Western Canada that coal and oil existed in this area. Or really probably natives knew forever, but white people started talking about it in the early 1900s. And so the existence of the coal was not a shock come the 1960s, 1970s, but there had not been any movement to actually mine. And so this purple star, kind of just north of the Canadian border, was the proposed site of the Cabin Creek mine. So just to pause a little bit before I get too deep into that, what's also interesting about this map, you have Glacier National Park and Waterton make up the world's first international peace park, big deal. Glacier Waterton is also a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve, so it's this internationally recognized crucial ecosystem. Obviously, the Flathead River system is part of the Wild and Scenic River system. This is critical habitat for grizzly bears, highest density for grizzly bears in the lower 48. This basin is the last intact wildlife corridor for grizzly bears, for Canada wolf, for Canada lynx on the US-Canadian border. Water is rated among the purest in the world. All these stats are coming from a United Nations report, so super legit. They're critical salmonid habitats with bull trout. There's some genetically pure West Slope cutthroat trout. Long story short, there are not many places in the world like this in terms of like the overlays of protection, but then also the quality of ecosystem, the species that live there. Incredible place. Okay, jumping in to the timeline. And I'm going to use a lot of these newspaper clippings. Thank you to Lois Walker, who's sitting in here. I ended up, very fortunately, during my research, getting access to countless, a lot of it's old Hungry Horse News, some of it's the Missoulian, but I thought it'd just be fun to kind of pepper those in. So in 1974, Montanans hear for the first time that there is a serious proposal from the Sage Creek Coal Limited Company, I think, to mine at Cabin Creek. And so this coal mine poses threat to Flathead water. That was the very first mention of this threat that I could find in any written source. And it's early February 1974 in the Missoulian. And then the above picture, you can actually kind of see somebody at that time went out there and took the shot. And so at this point, Northwest Montanans become deeply concerned and kind of start talking about this. What can we do? So for the next couple of years, there was this really big push as the process was kind of slowly developing up in BC to try to stop it. And so you had several bodies kind of come into being, the Flathead Coalition being one of the most well-known ones, that was a group. Part of its power was, it was an advocacy group, but part of its power was derived from the fact that it was made up of the Kalispell Lions Club, the Kalispell Chamber of Commerce, environmental advocacy groups, environmental nonprofits, local members. It didn't necessarily go down typical party lines or anything. This was like a pretty slice of life of Northwest Montana, who was deeply concerned. And eventually this group is able to pressure Max Baucus, who at that point is a senator for Montana, to set aside a little bit of money for an environmental impact statement, about $3 million. And so that turned into the Flathead River Basin Environmental Impact Study. And I have this article kind of blown up so big because it says, Ron Cooper, director of the Environmental Impact Statement or Study, will be speaking to the North Fork Preservation Association on Thursday, April 15th. That's 1982. And they were going to talk at the Polebridge Hostel. So that's kind of cool. Just a little, you could, like, these groups that are still working on these issues today were active 40 years ago. This study was really compelling because it was the first time that a large-scale, very legitimate scientific study with federal funding came out. And they did, in fact, find that runoff from the coal mines on the British Columbia side would negatively impact the river and the broader basin. And this was a very big deal for them, for advocates against the mine, kind of in this early effort to have some credible evidence to use and to point to when they were further advocating moving forward. I also love the cover. Like, studies are definitely, that's just like a beautiful cover. It's not like that anymore, I fear. Okay, so jumping ahead. And there are some big ideas in here that I'm not going to be able to drill too deep down into. But, so the IJC, the International Joint Commission, oversees the Boundary Waters Treaty, which is a 111-year-old treaty between the US and Canada that kind of governs the waters that flow between the two countries. And they're not only Canada into the US. Obviously, the Great Lakes, it's kind of back and forth. The Milk River, for instance, in Montana goes, I don't know if it's Alberta or Saskatchewan at that point, but it comes out of Canada into Montana, back into Canada, back into Montana. So the IJC is this huge body, and in 1985, U.S. Montana environmental advocates, leaning on their elected officials at the federal level, were able to convince the International Joint Commission to take up this referral and actually do a study at this international level about the potential effects of the coal mine at Cabin Creek. And the IJC, what's kind of cool about it is that the study, it's mandated that the study would involve, it was 50 Canadian scientists and 50 American scientists. So it's this deeply equitable process. And so theoretically, any outcome would be trusted by both sides to a greater extent. This has that much more clout. Any outcomes of this have that much more clout than, for instance, the environmental impact statement or study that I mentioned just a minute ago, because that's really only a US effort. This is an international effort. So it's a big step up in terms of relevance and funding and the clout of the findings. And so this ponds fail at Canadian Mine, that's a High Country News article from 1986. And it just so happens that, so meanwhile, you know, you've got this whole fight over mining in the Flathead Basin, but meanwhile, on the Elk River side of the basin over, they have already been mining. Those mines aren't that old, but they've been mining. And the scientists who are on, at one day, the scientists who are on the Flathead side decide to go over and take a look at these big containment ponds. So one of the big questions with coal mining is, what do you do with the water runoff? What do you do with the dust? Like, you can't just let it wash downstream. You kind of need to hold it in these big, like, rubber-lined basins. And that's this, like, crucial aspect of determining the potential viability and the potential of the mine to not destroy the environment. And so all these scientists doing this IJC study go over to look at the Elk River, I think it was the Teck mine in Sparwood, and they go over to look at these containment basins, which they're specifically interested in. And on that day, there is this, like, legendary rainstorm and the basins blow out. And they're supposed to be unblowoutable, you know, like these, they'll last forever type of things. And, you know, it's unclear exactly the extent to which that influenced the IJC scientists, but the anecdotes go that it was this kind of profound moment of, like, whoa, maybe we don't have this under control. And eventually, fortunately, the IJC findings are specifically that the issue became these bull trout, so that the bull trout cross over. Some of them actually spawn on the BC side, and their spawning grounds at Cabin Creek would be negatively affected by any potential coal mine at that location. And so there's this kind of clause which within the Boundary Waters Treaty, I'm getting too deep into this, but basically, because the Montana bull trout would have been negatively affected, it was determined that the mine was a threat. Please, Allie.
There's a question about that mine, and I think also the proposed mine on the Flathead side. Would it have been strip mining or underground?
I think it was strip mining. Yeah. And that the strip mining is what they do up on in Sparwood, but I believe it's also strip mining was proposed at Cabin Creek. Over the years, there are several proposals, and so, as we'll kind of get into, but lots of different ways were explored for getting coal and oil and natural gas out of the Flathead Basin. Okay. Cool. So now we're into the early 90s, and this is a bit of a quieter time. At this point, the initial Cabin Creek proposal, due largely, at least this was publicly the word, market forces had kind of, coal had dropped to such a low value in the late 80s, and the cost of putting in a road and building the mine, they were sometimes actually talking about putting in a railroad, and they would have had to get the coal all the way to the coast. So it's not only getting it out of the basin, but it's also getting it all the way to the coast. The cost had become prohibitive. And so you could wonder to what extent the mining company backing off also had to do with the findings of these studies I've mentioned and kind of mounting political pressure, mounting pressure from advocacy groups. But at the end of the day, what they said was that market forces have we're backing off. And so we get into the 90s and what is a quieter period in this fight, but a couple important things happen at the British Columbia level. And so I included this map of British Columbia to show you. So Victoria is kind of low center, it's the bottom left of British Columbia, but from Victoria over to say Fernie is over 600 miles. And so the end plus the Flathead Basin on the Canadian side is barely populated. It's not even very well populated on the other side. I mean, even Fernie, all these little towns, not many people there. And so the reason I included this map was just to kind of put into perspective that the people making a lot of these decisions, none of them live closer than 600 miles, 1,000 kilometers, they would say, to this location. And so it just puts into perspective a little bit like how I don't want to say out of touch, but how disconnected the decision makers are with this place, with this locale. And this happens all over the world, but for this specific example, it feels important. So in the mid 90s, there was a kind of a flip to a more progressive BC government, and they did a big land use plan. So in Canada, at the provincial level, many more of the decisions are made about land use management, whereas in the US, it's at the federal level where many more of the decisions are made, not the state level. So it's a bit of a flip-flop. But so BC in the mid 90s kind of swings left and comes up with this much more progressive. There's still going to be some proposed resource extraction from the basin, but they're talking about turning the basin into much more of a protected area, removing some extractive rights and so forth. But then in the late 90s into the early 2000s, there's another election and the whole politics swings right. And by 2003, they've basically opened the entire basin. They've lowered the clearing point. So mining companies are going to have an easier and easier time getting the permits they want. And then they've opened more and more of the basin to mining. And so over this 10 years, you kind of have this like swing to the left and swing to the right. But basically by the early 2000s, the British Columbia, the Victoria government is doing everything they can to make some money off of this little far off corner of their province and provide jobs. You know, it's not all evil. You know, it would have done amazing things for the local economy. Not arguing with that, but probably wasn't going to benefit the environment very much. So here is a 2004 cover of Oil Week magazine. So this CBM hunt is on. That's coal bed methane. So that's natural gas, that's fracking. And this image, and then it's kind of blurred out, but it says a pioneer's view of CBM development in Canada. That is specifically referencing coal bed methane found in the Flathead Basin. And so this map I included, the dark red, the brick red, and then where it's brown, where it's overlaid, those were seams, I guess you would say, of coal bed methane that were discovered. And coal bed methane, fracking technology had advanced rapidly, and all of a sudden there was this new opportunity, and there's a lot of money to be made there. And so by the mid 2000s, which can't forget to mention is also the time that Vancouver by then had secured the 2010 Olympics, and the province of British Columbia needed to generate some serious cash to pay for those Olympics. By the early mid 2000s, they are really hoping that the mining rights will be sold off to develop CBM. And so it's a little tougher to see here, but the Lodgepole mine, which is kind of in the middle, basically, of that big brown section, that now becomes the big target. So it's no longer, the Cabin Creek mine is still an option, but it's that Lodgepole mine that becomes kind of the primary focus for mining companies. Yes. So then we get to kind of into the late 2000s, and we have, and again, I've included a map. I'm a geographer, so to me, these maps are like deeply meaningful and interesting, but maybe to you they're not. But so I included the map because what starts happening more and more in this time period is that British Columbia and Montana start talking more. And that largely means Governor Schweitzer at that time, and then Gordon Campbell, who was premier of British Columbia. They start talking more and interacting more. And why that's noteworthy is that British Columbia and Montana do not have any, they're not like scales of government that have any authority with each other. Really, they don't make laws with each other. They can't really create any truly binding agreements. But it turns out that these guys like kind of strike up a friendship, which is kind of amazing and remarkable considering where we are these days in politics. But they strike up a friendship, and things start to get a little bit easier between the two sides, because another part I haven't really touched on is that so the big coal fields in this basin just so happen to be on the Canadian side of the basin. As a result of that, over this time period, there is very, very little pressure from the US mining companies, the US mining interests, to mine on the US side of the basin. And so if you would say that kind of four groups of people, two on each side of the border. Let's say on the US, there are like environmentalists and then people who care more about the economy. And then on the Canadian side, there are environmentalists and people who care more about the economy. Because the coal was really only on the BC side, 3/4 of those four want this mine to not happen. So the economy people on the US side don't really have a dog in the fight. And so instead, to them, there's a little more room for the argument to protect this wild place to kind of take hold. And so that's one of the fortunate things about this story. Had there been as much coal on the US side of the border, I kind of assume that we would have a coal mine up there. Who knows? But there would have been much less motivation for the US to present such a united front. And that's at the county level, at the state level, at the federal level. The US pretty consistently presented a united front against this coal mine. Meanwhile, there had always consistently been groups of people on the BC and the national Canadian level who opposed it, but this economic push, specifically in BC, which doesn't necessarily have, they have a lot of timber, but in terms of natural resources, not necessarily the wealthiest province. And so there'd long been this kind of will to increase the extractive industries within the province. And so you have these two heads of state, heads of governments that don't necessarily have a legitimate claim to interacting with each other, and yet they get to know each other. And they just kind of slowly grease the wheels, and communication starts flowing a little bit easier. Obviously, we both speak English, both sides, but that doesn't mean that we view these topics the same way. And so another thing that's happening in this time is that a body called Flathead Wild, which was kind of a reincarnation in some ways of the Flathead Coalition. So Flathead Wild is groups like the National Park Conservation Association. There's some like Hook and Bullet groups on the BC side. They team up and they try to start creating more public pressure on the British Columbia government to shut down these mines, to not even open these mines. And so they're doing that through things like very well publicized hikes. So they have like Harvey Locke is this famous environmentalist on the BC side. He starts leading these hikes in the basin. They do this big winter traverse that gains a lot of publicity in the Vancouver Sun is writing about it. That's Vancouver's big paper. They have artists and residents kind of going up there and generating photographs and paintings. And then they have art gallery openings where in Banff and in Calgary and in Missoula, where they're kind of pushing this message. And the Canadian, I think I have a photo coming up of Canadian Geographic gets involved. And so they're trying to build this cultural push towards how do we talk to the people in Vancouver and Victoria about this issue if they're never going to come here maybe, or they've never been here? It's about telling the story better, and it's about imagery, and it's about video. I mean, they generated video content. There's a documentary. They started telling the story in different ways and trying to generate kind of new kinds of social pressure. And this is kind of in the run-up to the Olympics, but also as the coal bed methane sale is upcoming. And I couldn't find, yesterday as I was kind of getting this, I couldn't find an article about it, but about this time, the British Columbia puts the coal bed methane rights up for sale. And British Columbia has said that they're bringing in British Petroleum, BP, one of the biggest oil companies in the world, that BP has interest, and they're bringing BP in. And the mining rights go up for sale, and nobody makes an offer. And it's this huge coup for environmentalists who have put so much pressure. I mean, the story that was told about John Frederick going to these mining company board meetings, basically, and kind of throwing a wrench in their gears by being the only person to, a lot of these people could never think of not doing these things, And so this push by Flathead Wild to convince these multinational corporations to not bid on these coal bed methane rights was kind of echoed John Frederick's efforts that if you can just get in these people's heads and kind of explain to them that you're not going away as an advocate, and that you do have a group of people behind you and a united front, a lot can happen. Okay. Cool. So here's some more kind of fun stories. So this picture is of Sparwood. So this is the Teck mine up here. This is strip mining. This is the background behind it is not the Flathead Basin, but very similar in appearance. And so I included this map again. The ugly little star I have kind of in the top left corner of that map is the general location of this mine. So it's very nearby. It's actually a little bit farther north of that, but whatever. So in 2009, some of the Flathead Wild guys, and which includes National Park Conservation Association folks. So Will Hammerquist, who now runs Polebridge, is one of these people. They are thinking of how can we generate even more kind of international awareness about this topic? Because just to recap, even though the coal bed methane sales had not gone well, that doesn't mean that the threat of future mining has at all gone away. And so the Waterton International Peace Park is a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve, and each Biosphere Reserve has a report that's kind of generated about it, and it has a little status, which is basically at risk or stable. And it's a big deal when a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve site switches to at risk. And so Will, and I forget who else, kind of get this idea that they're going to fly to Spain to the UNESCO annual meeting, and they're going to meet with UNESCO folks, and they're going to convince them to come over and do another study, and that the outcomes of that study, depending on whether or not they determine the potential mining on the Flathead side, could put below that, so it's the Glacier National Park area, at risk, then UNESCO could change the whole status of this biosphere reserve. And so they go over to Canada. I think, at this point we're talking I think it was maybe it's a DVD, I guess, but they roll out the TV. They have the video starts with kind of an invocation from Earl Old Person of the Blackfeet Reservation, that this is our ancestral tribal land. They give this presentation to the UNESCO representatives in Spain, and at the end of that, they vote that, yes, we will come over to Northwest Montana, Southeast BC, and we will do a study. We will check up on this reserve to see what is its status. And so then in 2009, these people come out, and it's just a handful of scientists from UNESCO, one from India, one from Italy, and they're kind of toured around. Aaron Sexton, Rich Hauer, two important ecologists who've basically kind of made their life's work off of the Flathead River system, are very involved in this. They're meeting with people, they're touring them around. And Rick, who's a professor at University of Montana now, he loves telling this story where they wanted to do a flyover of the basin, of the biosphere reserve. And so Rick happens to be a pilot, obviously, I guess, and he has a plane, and he's like, oh, I'll fly you, okay. And so they take off, and Rick said it was one of the most beautiful days that he's ever been on the North Fork, just perfect, crystal clear. And they're flying, also included this map to kind of visualize it. And so they're flying up from, the Columbia Falls, Kalispell area, and they're going up through this basin. They cross the international border, and then Rick takes them just a little bit farther, and he flies them over the mines, which hadn't been on the itinerary, but he flies them over these open strip mines. And he said that the two UNESCO representatives in that moment said, we've seen enough. We understand, and they turn around, they fly back, and the eventual findings are that this biosphere reserve is at risk. And so this is international news, basically, in some circles. And it's especially important news in Vancouver because the Olympics are coming up. Like, we're talking like months now. And Flathead Wild, and then with this big, these are like front page headlines, basically. Flathead Wild is making this push to use the Olympics. And Vancouver, I don't know if anyone remembers, but the whole like ad campaign for the Olympics was like, come see our wilderness and our wild places and our remarkable environments. And so in the meanwhile, you've got this like team of environmentalists being like, look what they're actually doing to their wildest place. They're about to tear it apart. Look, UNESCO, this amazing voice just said that this place is at risk. Pressure is mounting, we shall say. So here's this is in 2008. I know my dates are a little wonky, but this Canadian Geographic cover. So strip mine this. And what's neat about this, and it's kind of this interesting undercurrent that I always had a bit of a hard time tapping into during my research, because not for lack of effort, but it was just harder to find Canadian folks to talk to about this. But so this pristine Flathead Valley, says the magazine cover, its upper reaches may become an open pit coal mine. So I guess that one was proposed as an open pit mine to that earlier question. But so who is fighting hardest to save this beautiful place? Our American neighbors. So that's like kind of embarrassing. It's not like a good look, we'll say. And it's exactly the kind of thing that should put a fair amount of pressure on Victoria politicians. And so I wish there was like footage of some of this or something, but basically in the days before the opening ceremony of the Olympics, and at this point, you even have conversations going on at the federal level on both sides. So that would be Stephen Harper for the Canadians, Barack Obama on the US side. They've even kind of gotten glommed into this. By now, Max Baucus, who's obviously in the story earlier, well, I guess at that point, he might have been the diplomat to China, but he was the head of some of the most powerful Senate finance committees. And so he kind of has like the power of the purse. So you have these really important people having these conversations, immense pressure on the BC government to do something about this. And so they say the hours before the opening ceremony of the Olympics, Montana and BC reach a memorandum of understanding about basically removing mining rights from the Flathead River Basin. And so, again, this is like a very strange document in the sense that these are not levels of government that really can talk to each other. Even imagine like Flathead County making an agreement with Wyoming. So and it's even kind of weirder than that in some ways. And yet, so it's not a binding document, and yet it is a pretty powerful document because the parties involved understand how much pressure and work has gone into this. And so there's a lot of language there, but the end all be all is to we will remove mining rights from the basin. And actually, it's not that we'll remove mining rights from the basin, it's that we agree to both pass legislation in the future that will remove mining rights from the basin. And this is this is like, for a lot of people who've worked on this on both sides of the border, this is kind of the moment that they've waited at this point, like almost 40 years for. And I think something that I'm going to kind of touch on at the end of this, but that's just kind of fun to talk about, is like just this confluence of events. You know, without the Olympics does this happen, without UNESCO does this happen, it's without Brian Schweitzer and Gordon Campbell like actually becoming supposedly like actual friends, you know, outside of politics, like does this happen? It's hard to say, but there's just this amazing push in these last couple of years of the 2000s leading up to this. And then BC gets to, you know, they get to say, going during the Olympics, look at this amazing thing we've done, you know, so it's kind of like they can save face in a way, but they didn't get to help pay for the Olympics with coal from their basin. So then, and these are super boring headlines, obviously, but again, there aren't like necessarily photographs or like ideal visuals for some of these things, but British Columbia, which again in Canada, it matters. It wouldn't matter if, I guess it's Toronto, passed a law about this so much as, so it really matters that BC passed a law about this. In the same way that if Montana passed a law about no one can mine in the Flathead River Basin anymore, it's all federal land, you know, so that wouldn't really matter. What matters is that in DC, they passed a law about this. And so in 2011, BC passes the law forever removing mining rights. And we'll talk about this also, but that doesn't mean they removed like timber rights. That doesn't mean, it's not the placement on top of a layer of protection. It's just the removal of a couple of rights. Yes, Allie.
This is your 13-minute warning.
Oh, I was shooting for like 5 minutes, but okay.
Well, I'm just saying, that's how much time we have.
Cool. No, we're getting there.
No, you're doing a great job. I'm really enjoying this.
Good. So then in 2014, we have, God, was his name Bill Walsh or Steve Walsh? The guy on the left in that picture. He didn't last very long, but we have Tester and Daines. And I included the sponsor because they gave Daines the sponsorship. This was, it was a big deal to get Daines on board here. Obviously, it fits into the profile that he likes to have in Montana as being like friends of Hook and Bullet and friends of conservation. You know, it's like, does his voting record back that up? Hard to say, but on an issue like this, he got on board. He did. You can't argue with that, and he got the sponsorship. So it's a big deal. And this was the North Fork Watershed Protection Act, which removed mining rights from the basin, basically, is the big kicker. And there's some more there. You could, if you're interested, you can drill down into what this legislation actually says. But the gist, the real kicker, was the removal in perpetuity of mining rights from the basin. A big win for Montana politics, for sure. Okay, lessons learned. This took 40 years of like consistent effort, like people's careers, you know, like generations of people's careers to get done. And so in terms of like, you know, what the takeaway is there, it's just to do your part and keep the momentum, I think. And so something that I often think about, and I kind of touched on this already, but there was a lot of like luck involved here. So Max Baucus grew up spending some of his summers in Glacier National Park. And then when this issue, and then he gets voted into the Senate, of course, and then he becomes head of the Senate Finance Committee, which is like arguably the most powerful senator in the Senate. Meanwhile, this issue is kind of crescendoing. And so you just have this like incredibly influential politician who happens to love the place that you're fighting for. And then, as I mentioned, that it's just kind of sheer geographical luck that the BC side has most of the coal and not the US side. This is a different story if that coal deposit is split down the middle of the border or something. But I put luck like that because it's not, there was still incredible amounts of hard work and follow through, but there are just these little events that and happenings and people in play in this story that are hard to reproduce. What I will say about the people who worked on this over the years was that whenever there was an opportunity or a mechanism that could be triggered, advocates made that happen. And what I mean by that, and so for instance, with the International Joint Commission, so you have this Boundary Waters Treaty. This is like a internationally relevant piece of legislation. And deep inside of it, there is a little piece that says if both sides agree to it with this referral process, that a study can happen. And if that study finds that one party is negatively influencing the other, kind of like, it's not quite legally binding, but it's hugely influential. And so work of the Flathead Coalition, at that point, the Flathead Basin Commission, NFPA work, they saw that mechanism was within this legislation, which was in play in this location, and they made it happen. They made that study wasn't going to happen on its own. They made that study happen. And because of that, this issue took on a much higher level. The scientific evidence was that much more powerful. It's the same thing. The Wild and Scenic River Act existed. The North Fork, the Flathead wasn't on the first batch of rivers, if memory serves, but it could have been. And so they did the work to get it there. The British Columbia land use planning, obviously some of that kind of went anti-environmental, but the parts that did go environmental, they didn't have to. It's that they pushed for that to happen. Same thing with UNESCO. No one was going to come here and do that study that ended up changing the status of the park to at risk, but they pushed for it, and so it happened. So understanding the legislation in play and the context, and then triggering these little mechanisms, just incredibly important over time. And I kind of mentioned this, but the number of times that like the Flathead Coalition reemerged, or that a new person took over at the National Park Conservation Association, and they kept lists of phone numbers and the names of groups stayed the same, so that 20 years later when they bring it back, people are like, oh, I was interested in that 20 years ago, let me get involved again. The number of documents that kind of exist that have been kept from this process meant that each time it had to be picked up again, there was that much less friction. It was that much easier to pick up the fight again. So it is also very important that on the US side, there were a lot more people here, and Glacier is there, and Glacier is, one of the country's big draws. And so this was already a high profile place. Some of these issues were made easier, some of these fights were made easier by the fact that there were just Americans living here who deeply cared about this place and were willing to make that fight happen. And then a big finding of mine was that the Canadian side is to some extent kind of lost in a lot of the conversations we have in the US about this. There's less academic research about it. So like most academic work in reference to this topic refers to it as the North Fork, even though one of the countries involved does not refer to it as the North Fork, and little things like that. But whenever I did involve or interview Canadians or read Canadian literature about this, I found some pretty different opinions and different perspectives. They kind of at times wanted it to be their own fight. They have their own interests up there, which are not necessarily counter to the US interests, but at times they wished they could have had the fight on their own and the US hadn't been involved. And, I'm not sure what to make of that, but I think were we to still, in 10 years have to have another big fight about the Flathead River Basin, getting to know the Canadian perspective and involving the Canadians that much more would be, I think, a really good step in making progress on those issues. Okay, I think I have a couple fun little pictures, and then we'll go to questions.
Okay.
So this is a picture, this is on the US, this is kind of unrelated, but on the US side, these lines are, and this is from Hungry Horse News in the 80s, but this is where they did blasting to determine the viability of oil drilling on the US side. So they blasted all over the North Fork Basin on the US side. For summers and summers, they were down here. And nobody talks about that now, at least, I don't know, not many people I know. But so that happened. It's kind of crazy. And then in the late 40s, this is at Camas Creek. So this is an Army Corps of Engineer blueprint at Camas Creek. And they wanted to dam the North Fork the same way that they dammed the South Fork and wanted to dam the Middle Fork also. But so the Army Corps of Engineers was like pretty stoked about this idea of backing the river up kind of like across the border, kind of like Koocanusa. And went so far as, I mean, they did a lot of the plans. They had blueprints. They were doing public like conversations down in Kalispell about it. But this picture is kind of amazing to me because of how much it would change this place, obviously. And then finally, so this is about some New Yorkers in 1949 who were, these are like early environmentalists. So it's the crusade to remove, like to get rid of birdless hats. And so that was a big fight of the day, was like bird feathers. But one of the last paragraphs is, at the Conservation Society meeting, she will introduce a resolution recommending that the proposed Glacier View Dam project in Glacier National Park, Montana be rejected. And that's just to kind of show that even in the late 40s in New York City, people were aware of issues in the North Fork. And people were aware of how special this place was and how important it was to fight against it. So it kind of puts things into perspective a little bit. Yeah, it's just kind of a funny little thing. Okay, there's a bunch of sources. If anyone has any questions about like my sources or where I got all this information, I'm happy to circle back with you. Feel free to reach out. But that's it.
Thanks, Jed.
Yeah.
Lois does have some comments about your sources, and we're going to forward her comments as an email because I think she's uncovered 2 more boxes.
Oh my God. Okay.
Yeah. Oh, there's what are the current threats today?
I mean, there's a significant amount of, I don't know if they call it clear cutting, but there's a significant amount of logging on the BC side that I'm sure leads to a lot of erosion into the water. But I think the bigger threats today, I mean, climate change is humongous. Obviously, the snowpack is changing, the glaciers are changing, as the entire ecosystem, and this isn't only the river, but as the ecosystem changes, as water temperatures go up, the viability of bull trout habitat, West Slope cutthroat habitat, those trout need it cold. Like a shift in a few degrees can make this huge difference to them. You know, I don't really want to open the can of worms that is like permitting on the Flathead rivers, but use is skyrocketing on the whole river system. And so questions about impact to put-ins and to campsites, those need to be resolved. And I know the forest is working on that, the park is working on that, there's a new plan, but someday going to a permit system, or at least a system that limits access to overnight stays, seems like it's kind of got to happen if we want to maintain the ecosystem where it is today. And you should probably pave the road so there's less, no, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, that's still a current issue. Keep it gravel, Rachel Potter says. So we ended up with over 31 attendees, which
great.
That is absolutely fantastic. And thank you all for joining us and joining us on this webinar, and potentially joining us as a member of Montana Wilderness Association or the North Fork Preservation Association. If you're motivated and not a member, we would appreciate it.
Or as a crew member. Or as a crew member for the Montana Conservation Corps next week.
we can always use you if you want to be an activist in some way. There is space for you depending on what your interests and talents are.
And I also, my thesis is floating out there. If this was just so riveting to you that you want to get more theoretical with it, 40 years on the transboundary flathead, I don't even remember what it's called, but you're welcome to download it and read it. It's on the UMT library site. And lots of other good resources about this, probably better writing.
All right. Flannery, you want to say anything before I log us all off?
Oh, just thank you very much. That was super awesome. And I'm just echoing all the webinar chat comments as well. There's a lot going on. Everybody really appreciates and thinks this was fascinating.
Glad to hear it. Oh yeah, cool. Fun. Yeah, that was fun. That was great.
Well, thank you, Jed. Thanks for putting yourself through that.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I have a question about whether or not I maintain my subscription to Oil Weekly. Oh yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. Cool. Thanks, guys.
All right, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.